Hi, this is Jason. Today I'm going to show you how our digital consent process works for volunteer science. Now, let's assume you've already created an experiment and you need to add a consent form. There are two steps to this process. The first is to actually upload the form, so what it is that people are going to see and what they're going to sign, and then you'll need to bind it to the study. And what the binding does, it allows you to specify a date range for that consent form to apply and for some logistics around how it should apply. So I'm going to go over all of this, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand how to integrate digital consent into volunteer science experiments. So let's get started. I have my experiment here, copy of chat demo in my test account. It's already a study that works. It's just a chat room. And notice in the demo, I already have a consent form attached to this. In the demo, you're not going to see this. You don't see the consent form pop up. The only way you can test your consent forms is by actually putting it in an experiment live on the website. But just so you know, this is a study. It's just a little chat room. There's nobody else playing it. I'm just doing it as a single person. So I can say, hey, chat pops up. Anyway, that's the experiment. So all I'm doing is I'm putting a consent form in front of it. So go over to the consent tab. This is all going to be empty. Let me just show you what an empty one looks like. A copy of chat demo, just so I can go back to it. This is what the empty version looks like. The first thing you need to do is upload your consent form. So as you'll notice, actually, there's already a drop down here because I've already uploaded a consent form before. So you can actually reuse a consent form across studies. So reuse the same text. Anyway, you want to say browse, you go to your consent form. I have an HTML file, which is just this test consent. You can also use PDFs. I'll just show you what that looks like. It's open, test consent, submit. Oh, it already exists. I have to give it a new name. Perfect, I love hitting bugs. Or not bugs, but errors that you usually don't see. So to get I think I'd have to, yeah, so test consent 2. Submit. Cool, so I have test consent 2. It's the same document. And this, again, as I said, this one's an HTML file. We also accept PDFs. So you can either create an HTML consent form or a PDF consent form. Both work. So you've uploaded the file. You need to then bind it to this particular study. I'll show you on this copy of chat demo. I've already done this. I'll just do it here again. So you have your form. So the form is now that the form is bound to it, you can see this. We actually monitor the versions for the form. So if you're updating it, you say you change your phone number or you need to change some of the text of your consent form, you can change it and then re-upload it as a different version, and you can set the different version that's active. Again, the whole purpose for this and the purpose for having bindings with still valid dates is that some studies you want to be able to reuse. So, especially like a demographic survey. You use the same survey over and over again for multiple studies, and rather than having to do a new consent form for every new version of the study and a new version of the study, every time you run a different set of sample, you can use the same study and just have an updated consent form covering the time frame in which you recruited subjects for an individual study. It's a very flexible system for consent. But just the basics here. I've uploaded the form, and now I can determine the bindings, and I can determine how it's shown. So mandatory just means that they have to say yes before taking the study. So you click the check mark, you click set. Don't forget to click set. The other thing is always show. So this means that they have to see it every time they do the study. Sometimes somebody can take a study and then come back and they don't have to do the consent again. Sometimes they need to do the consent every time. And so this is what that's for. So mandatory, if they say no, they get kicked out of the study. If they say yes, they go on. Same thing with always show. They always have to see it. I'm going to actually unclick this because it's just kind of inconvenient for testing. The other thing that you do is with these bindings, you can set a valid date and time that it's bound. So say I'm doing this study for the next 3 months with this particular consent form, and then I'm going to redo the study, next year for a second, as a part of a second series of instruments. I can bind the same consent form, but with a different date. The other thing that's most important is this type drop down. So there's an AMT, a default, and a default pre. Now AMT is for Mechanical Turk, and all that does is it shows the consent form for Turkers, only for Turkers, and before they actually start the hit. So if they don't consent, they don't actually have a reject on their record, and they actually have to say yes. They actually have to consent before they can accept the hit. So that's AMT. It's special to AMT. The default mode is actually going to wait for the study itself to call to request the consent. So there's a function on volunteer science called pop-up consent. And whenever you call pop-up consent, if somebody hasn't signed the consent form, it will actually render the consent form and ask them to sign it. So this allows you to give people some part of the experiment or some interactivity with your study before they actually have to then sign consent. Volunteer science actually originally founded to have people create data, participate to their however much they wanted, and then they would donate their data at the end. So if they felt like they wanted to give their data over to science, they could. And so the default says you can ask for consent whenever. And if it's mandatory, if it's always show, or if they have to see it, it shows up at the end. So when you do the experiment complete, ending the study, the consent form will pop up, and then you'd make it ask, now that you've done the experiment, do you want to donate your data to science? So default gives you the most customization. Default pre is showing volunteers, and I should say default only shows for volunteers, not for Turkers. But default pre forces it's the same thing as the AMT. It forces users to see the consent form before the study loads. That way, the study doesn't load if they don't. If you set it to mandatory, if they don't consent, then it won't load. But it shows up before the study begins. This is really important for multi-person experiments where you don't want people who don't consent to start a study if you have it set to mandatory, if they have to consent. So you don't want them to enter a group or get matched to a group if they haven't already consented. And we'll update this, default pre, and then click submit. So the way this is set, this is not mandatory. They would only see it once. If they've already signed it, they'll have to sign it once. And then it's going to be default pre. So it's going to show up at the beginning of the study before they even start. So let me show you what that actually looks like. Again, you can't test it in the demo tab. You have to test it live. So this is what the copy of chat demo is about. I've already created this. So I put it up on my little test page. Oops. Experiment/Jason test. I have my consent demo. So here's this chat room. Press play. This is the consent form. This is that HTML file. It just says online consent form, some study. I've adapted one of our old ones for this. So you have your basic consent language. It's going to take 20 minutes. You register. It's voluntary. Everything's confidential. If you have problems, contact us. If you have questions or want to file a complaint, you can file a complaint with the IRB, all that stuff. So all you're doing as the researcher is you're providing the text. Volunteer science provides these buttons. So when somebody says, I consent or I do not consent, we create a digital signature for that particular user. So the user will say, I consent or I do not consent, and you'll get that signature. So I'm going to consent to show you what it looks like. So I consent, and now I start this chat. Hi, I consented. Cool. And I'm going to quit. Bam. Okay, so let me show you what that data then looks like. So here's the beginning. So this is my data. I said one thing. Hey, actually, this is old. Where's the new one? Here we go. So I consented. So the way you know somebody consented is you have a number. So this is consent ID 103118. So you say, hi, I consented. And actually, if you'll notice, I said it here before. This now has the same consent number because I was demoing it earlier. Um, and so now that I consented to the current version, I actually will backdate the consent to every time I participated in this study. And this is why this valid from, valid until matters. So as long as somebody consents, um, it applies to all of the data for that study, unless you set this this window, change the window. If they don't consent, I don't know if there's any data here yet. What study is this? Balanced randomization demo. Did I already consent to this? Maybe because it's the same file, the same binding. But anyway, so if somebody doesn't consent, this just says false. Consent equals false. Consent is done at the experiment level. So if I consent to copy of chat demo, I'm not consenting to balanced randomization, and I'm not consenting to anything else, even if it's the same document. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know. Email us at support@volunteerscience.com. Thank you so much.